Hello and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to share with you Ark's top 10 most underrated tames. In at number 10 is the Angler. Now this thing was released way back, and I do definitely fondly remember this thing from Squid's old Ark series, and his last episode on the Bongoman's Island map was taming the Anglerfish, and still to this day this is actually a pretty useful creature for some certain specific Ark tasks, especially with their silica pearl gathering abilities, and that is pretty much all they have going for them. But silica pearls, if you didn't know already, are an extremely useful Ark resource, so that is why they are an extremely useful Ark creature which many people don't talk or even tame at all, and they just don't question it as a creature. They'll always go for something else. And yes, there are better sea creatures out there, but the Angler is great earlier on to mid-game stages in Ark, where you can't fully shell out for the most powerful ocean tames, but you still want to farm all of those silica pearls to get your fabrication up to the max. These creatures are really worth a tame at some point, as they aren't difficult at all, and they are extremely useful for gathering up all of those silica pearls. In at number 9 is the Chalicotherium. Now you may think this creature is just utterly useless, or you may think this creature is an absolutely insane tame and 100% worth it. And I'm kind of leaning more onto that side, as this creature does have a lot of abilities which many other creatures don't have. And also the Chalicotherium has an absolutely insane knockback attack, and it is just a generally good creature for just dealing a lot of damage. It's a bit like a slightly worse Megatherium, which really does pack a punch, and it actually is a very decent travel mount as well. It has a very respectable speed stat, one of what you will not complain with at all, and it does have a wealth of other abilities as well, like it being able to throw literal rocks of, I think, even feces at the enemy player. But this ability will take some time to actually practice and get right, as it is a somewhat difficult ability to control, but when done right, it is a really fun, cool ability which does have many uses as well, as it essentially makes this thing a long-range fighting dinosaur, which many other Ark creatures simply do not have. The only one I can really think of off of hand is the Velonosaur's turret ability. In at number 8 is the Carbonemys. Now I know this will be a somewhat unpopular opinion among many of you, but in my opinion, my personal opinion, I really do enjoy the Carbonemys in the early stages of my Ark playing. In those early stages, it is extremely useful to get yourself a creature that can grind all of that oil and those silica pearls and all of those underwater resources. Yes, I will definitely agree this isn't the best creature out there to gather all of those berries and just harvest general things, as I'm pretty sure this thing can't even gather berries, but if it can, it is still an extremely slow Ark creature, which isn't great on land at all. But when it comes into the water, the Carbonemys does actually have some reasonable speed, and yes, just for reference, this B-roll does have some boosted speed on the Carbonemys, as I think it just looks really funny, and it definitely is really funny in my opinion. Comment down below if you think a really fast Carbonemys waggling its little legs really quickly is funny. You know, some people do, and I'm definitely one of those people. But yes, as you can see here in the B-roll, this is me going to gather some oil from the kind of depths of the ocean. Not obviously right to the bottom, as that wouldn't be great, as your player would simply run out of oxygen. As the time when you're getting the Carbonemys, you will not have the scuba tank. I'm pretty confident you won't. So yeah, you can always go into those lakes and lower lying rivers, and there you'll find some oil and definitely some silica pearls, and that is where I think the Carbonemys really shines the most. In at number 7 is the Beelzebufo. Now I know loads of people on my channel really do not feel as if the Beelzebufo is underrated, and they extremely love this creature, and they think it is one of the most popular Ark creatures. And among quite a lot of Ark players, the Beelzebufo is definitely very popular for its cementing paste gathering abilities. But the fact is, a lot of Ark players as well simply discount the Beelzebufo, and I was one of them before I tried it, as they will just simply say beaver dams are the most efficient way to gather cementing paste, and there isn't a point of spending all of that time to get yourself one of these absolutely amazing charming Ark frogs, which now obviously I have turned my opinion over is simply not the case. In insect caves like the one on the island, the Beelzebufo really does shine, and you can gather thousands and thousands of cementing paste. And with Ark being a buggy game as well, sometimes beaver dams don't even spawn and can be an absolute nuisance to find. So knowing that you can literally just find some insects on a Beelzebufo to get that cementing paste is actually extremely useful as well, where you just can't find beaver dams and you just can't find that cementing paste. The Beelzebufo is definitely the best creature out there for reliable, quick cementing paste gathering. In at number 6 is the Castoroides. Now again, you may be kind of on the edge like the Beelzebufo with this creature, as you may either love it or hate it. These creatures do seem to be quite Marmite creatures, as you may just not see the use in taming a Castoroides. But before you have the chainsaw in Ark, the Castoroides is one of the best creatures for gathering wood. And you all know wood is a resource which you will need a lot of throughout the game. Right from the beginning all the way to the end stages of the Ark game, you will need all of that wood. The amount of wood that you will need in one Ark map playthrough is absolutely insane, and the beaver will really help you to actually get you there. And also the beaver is an extremely fast creature as well, and great in the water too, so it is a sort of upgrade to the Carbonemys if you still can't get a creature that is underwater capable that actually spawns in the water, like the Megalodon or Ichthyosaurus or Plesiosaurus or Mosasaurus, which you may not have at the stage when you'll be taming these things. And also on top of that, they have an extra little special spicy ability as well, which makes them really nice to use. The fact is their saddle is just a really nice portable smithy, extremely useful. In at number 5 is the Spinosaurus, and what a creature this is, and also in my opinion what an underrated carnivore, as the Rex always seems to take the spotlight away from the Spinosaurus. And in my opinion, the Spinosaurus is pretty much what a Rex is, and in some cases it can be easier to tame, as it does spawn in less hostile environments, and it definitely has a lot of really great uses that the Rex simply can't partake in. Firstly, it has a really amazing turning circle, which the Rex simply can't compete with, as it can turn 360 on the spot, whereas the Rex's turning circle is absolutely atrocious, and in many situations it is so bad you can even get your Rex killed because it can't turn around and attack the creature that is attacking by its feet. Also, the Spinosaurus is great in the water too, and I'm pretty sure it does have an oxygen stat, even though it may not as well. I'm kind of a bit in between. It may have had one in the past and now it doesn't. Either way, its oxygen stat is really great, and it is a great underwater creature with creatures like the Baryonyx, the Mosasaurus, the Plesiosaurus, the Basilosaurus. The list literally goes on for underwater creatures, and unlike most underwater creatures, and pretty much every creature apart from this and the Shadowmane, it has the hydration buff, so it will do even more damage when in water, which is just simply great, as with any carnivore, you always like to have a buff. Sadly, it does not have the bleed ability, but still, that hydration buff is absolutely OP, and when it goes back onto its hind legs, this thing will do even more damage on top of that. It is definitely a great boss creature, and actually overall, I'm pretty sure it does more damage than the Rex, as it can attack faster, and I think its damage stat is higher. Its only real downside is its health is slightly worse than something like a Rex. In at number 4 is the Baryonyx. Now, this creature is definitely one of my favorites, and one creature that I will never forget in my Ark journey, and I'm surprised that so many other people don't talk about this to the extent that I do. And yes, it is not the most underrated creature out there, but I definitely think every single Ark player should have a Baryonyx in their roster of creatures, and they should know how to tame one effectively, efficiently, and know how to use one effectively as well. Yes, Shadowmanes are really great for caves now, but still the Baryonyx is my go-to 100%, as obviously its size means that this thing can fit into pretty much any cave. And compared to the Shadowmane, I'm just more used to using the Baryonyx, and yes, it may not be quite as versatile in terms of travel. In my opinion, this thing is still extremely useful and deserves a use even though in some cases it is somewhat overtaken by the Shadowmane. Except the Shadowmane doesn't have the secret little ability that the Baryonyx has hidden up its sleeve. When it's in the water, it can literally stun creatures if you press C. And yes, the Shadowmane may have the hydration buff and things like that. The Shadowmane is a really great creature, don't get me wrong. It's just for things like caving and underwater exploration, I will always go Baryonyx before Shadowmane. And I would urge you to do that too. And also, they are a lot more accessible than the Shadowmane, as they do spawn on the island. Yes, I know the Shadowmane can be found on Fjorda, at least I'm pretty sure it can be found on Fjorda. So it is free to every Ark player out there, apart from Switch, I think doesn't have Fjorda yet, and obviously mobile doesn't. But on spawning on the island, it really does mean that this creature is the most accessible that it can be. Definitely worth the tame. In at number 3 is the Allosaurus. Yet again another carnivore, which some people again may say they use all the time. But I really think the Allosaurus does not get the press that it really deserves, like the Spinosaurus and the Bary, as the Allo is by far one of the best boss creatures in Ark in general. And yes, the Rex may have more health, but the Allosaurus does an extremely immense amount of damage in packs, and it is just by far one of the most useful combat creatures in Ark. And with its pack buff, which obviously it will get from being in a pack, it can be buffed even more than a Rex can. And if you combine that with UT buffs on top of that, and the Daedon healing everything, you can have yourself a really, really great boss environment with Allos. And if you do breeding and mutations, you can have yourself an absolutely insane pack of Allos. And they don't tend to be as absolutely mind-bogglingly stupid as a Rex. These things will pretty much never get stuck on anything in the Ark terrain. And also, if you're doing the Overseer on the island, I would probably recommend bringing Allos, as getting through the tech cave with Rexes, just those Rexes, man, they will just get stuck in the lava and they will just die, and they'll just fall in the most stupid places, and it is really, really infuriating trying to retrieve them. So I will always use something like the Allo or the Spino if I'm feeling like it for the Overseer boss on the island. And I've only used Rexes once, and I completely regret it, as pretty much all of my army was killed in the tech cave, as all of the Rexes just decided, I don't want to live anymore, and I'm just going to jump straight into that lava. But obviously the Allo does not have any of those issues, and unlike the Rex, it has the all famous bleed ability. Definitely a carnivore to be proud and worth taming. In at number 2 is the Mantis. Now again, this is one of Ark's most accessible creatures, with this thing spawning on maps like Ragnarok. And yes, albeit it may not have the easiest taming method out there, requiring you to passive feed it woolly rhino horns on Ragnarok, or you can use Deathworm horns as well, and you will have to use Deathworm horns on the original map that it came on, which is Scorched Earth. And I get that many people do recognize the Mantis out there, but like the others, I really think everyone should have a Mantis in their roster, as some people may think it's just weak, useless, not worth it. Why even bother with all the prep and all of that just effort to get yourself some really good Mantises? And to that, I would say they are extremely great harvesters, and on a map like Ragnarok, these are by far the go-to creature for gathering all of that mutton up. And they're definitely really fun harvesters to use as well. And pretty much any melee weapon that you can think of, apart from tech melee weapons, I'm pretty sure, these things will be able to wield and use to such a high level of ability. The only real downside to using a Mantis with your tools is the durability factor to it. But if you have Ascendant tools, then you will have a really great time, as those weapons are not going to break as often. The Mantis is definitely a tame every Ark player should have in their roster, and one every Ark player should tame, and in my opinion, it doesn't get the support that it actually really needs. And finally, in at number 1 is the Carnotaurus. Now, many people wouldn't have expected this thing to be in the number 1 slot, but in my opinion, the Carno is my favorite carnivore in Ark. Yes, I prefer it even above the Baryonyx. The amount of nostalgia I have with this creature and the amount of success I've had with this creature is absolutely insane. And when I did Genesis 1 for the first time, I beat the Master Controller, albeit on Gamma, with the Carnotauruses, and it went extremely well, and it was an extremely fun and useful boss fight for me to have. The Carnotauruses are actually a very very viable boss creature. Albeit they won't do what a Rex, a Spino, or an Allo can, they are still a really good middleman for doing those gamma boss fights, and you can definitely push for beta and alpha depending on what the fight is, just maybe not with the master controller. And did you also know that Carnotaurus, translated from Latin into English, means meatball, which is why I always call my Carnotauruses meatball, partly because it sounds funny, but also it is just accurate to what Carnotaurus actually means. Also, since the Carnotaurus' release, this thing has been TLC'd, now having a second attack where it will headbutt the enemy creature and deal that all-famous bleed ability, which only one other creature on this list so far, being the Allosaurus, actually has. And again, this is something that something like the Spino or the Rex doesn't have, which is why it is extremely useful to have yourself a Carnotaurus, and as always, call this thing Carny Dave. In at number 10, we have got the Megalosaurus, and this creature is just so full of great abilities, and compared to maybe something like the Rex or the Spino, this creature really doesn't get as much as I think it deserves to in actually how much damage this creature can do, and what this creature like really can do in terms of like it can really pack a punch in any kind of battle scenario. This creature does hefty amounts of damage, which most people probably don't even think of, as they just think, well, this thing sleeps in the day, it must be completely useless. And although there is a slight hindrance to that, I still think it is well worth it, because in the night time these things are so vicious. If you're on operation, then you're going to have a pretty easy time with this thing, because obviously it counts as nighttime all the time, so you can use it all the time. But still, on every other map, they're really great for boss fights if you want to do that with them, and they can even grapple small creatures in their mouths, and they're pretty good alpha killers as well. And they're alright at caving as well. Maybe they don't fit into quite as many caves as the Baryonyx, but they still do fit into pretty much all of them, as you know, they're quite a decent size, and they're pretty decent just like general traveling mounts, and really good, like they're really good at also defeating the dragon actually, which is a point which I should add, because these things can kill the Dimorphodons very easily as they can grapple them in their mouths, and it's actually a pretty decent boss strat, which I would definitely recommend you doing as long as you have high enough level Megalosauruses, because you know the dragon's particularly harsh to some carnivores. Now, some of you may kind of be hating on me a little bit for putting this better than the Megalosaurus. I don't maybe think that this is a better creature than the Megalosaurus. It's just for what it does, it's more useful for the general Ark player. But personally, I would go for Megalosaurus over the Castoroides. It's just the Castoroides is such an insane gatherer of wood. I have to put it higher because wood is just such an essential resource in Ark, and also you can get using it earlier as well. It's easier to tame because it spawns in a much nicer environment, and it's also a pretty good underwater mount as well, and you can gather quite significant amounts of energy paste from the beaver dams of this thing. But there is the next creature on the list, which I think is a significantly better way of getting all of that cementing paste gathered, of course. And these things also have a smithy as their saddle, which, you know, a portable smithy if you want to repair any of your metal items. Not really as useful as on the RG, but, you know, it's still a really nice thing to have. And I actually remember when this thing came out, and then that feature was there, and it was actually a pretty cool thing. Although, again, like I've said, the RG, it makes more sense for that creature, as it's this creature's not going to be the one to transport loads of metal around. Next up, we have got the Beelzebufo, and this creature is, in my opinion, just so overlooked. Like, people don't, like, they'll acknowledge this creature, like, they'll look at it and they'll just be like, well, it exists, but I'm never going to use it. Like, what's the point of this thing? I have beaver dams for all of my cementing paste used. Like, I don't need this thing whatsoever. But the fact that this is, like, it's just, it really does have an extremely great use for me, because obviously it's a really great cementing paste gatherer, and until you've used it, you probably won't know actually how good this thing actually is, because you're probably just like, well, beaver dams do it all for me. And I'm going to say they don't. You can gather just so much cementing paste with this creature. It's absolutely insane. Like with the insect cave, especially on ASA actually, as insects don't have levels anymore, you can get thousands, if not tens of thousands of cementing paste in one run, which will probably encumber you, but still, you can really gather just so much of the stuff. And it's pretty decent underwater as well, which again does play quite a nice big benefit towards it. Next up, we have got the Quetz in at the number 7 spot, and this creature is just one of those where I kind of just have to include it, like, instinctively. I feel like people just severely undervalue and overlook the Quetzal for what it actually is, because it doesn't need to be the fastest flyer out there, although maybe you might say it's really boring to just fly around on a slow flyer. If you build your base near to a mountain, then you're going to be fine, and it's no slower than something like a raft is, and people use that all of the time, and you can gather, well, not gather, but carry so many resources with this creature. And when you have a platform stand on top of it as well, you can have your own portable base there, and although maybe it might move slower than you want it to, you can still get a heck of a lot of resources across the map in quite a timely fashion compared to some other smaller creatures which will go faster because their weight isn't big enough, so you need to take several trips, or even some creatures which can, but then they're on land and they tend to be a little bit slower, and obviously you're on land as well, you'll be dealing with many other obstacles, where when you're in the air you can kind of just go in a straight line. So that's why the Quetzal's here. Next up, we've got the Crystal Wyvern, and I feel like people really undervalue this creature. I know it's an overlooked tier list, but I will say undervalued a lot in this, because they're kind of similars of each other. Overlooked is like to kind of skim over something, really, is kind of the general definition. And with a creature like this, I think people just devalue it for its tame method compared to the normal wyvern, because it's so much easier, so therefore this must be so much worse of a creature. Well, this thing is pretty much, I'm pretty sure actually, it's just the same strength as the wyvern. And with the Blood Crystal Wyvern, it really does prove an extremely useful one. With all the main features of a wyvern, just you get actually a nicer ability. The Blood Crystal Wyvern by far has the nicest ability out of any wyverns out there, and they also have the hydration buff, although maybe not the most useful because they're flyers. But you know, you ever stick their feet in a little bit of water, or you get those wings to touch water when you're actually flying over a lake, you can get that hydration buff, which again is going to buff you. And you can also use these things in the boss fight of Crystal Isles, so they must be pretty strong to actually like be useful in that fight, and they definitely are. So you really shouldn't undervalue these things for the tame methods. And I know there are a few things which make it a little bit more annoying, because the primary crystals are a little bit annoying to get, and the level 65 like starting level can be a little bit of an annoyance, but trust me, once you get those things down, you're really going to have a good time with these creatures. At number 5, we have got the Megalodon, and in my opinion, this is pretty much my favourite underwater creature to use just for like general combat and all of that. And yes, a Mosasaurus is going to be great and do all of that, but I find that a little bit too big and bulky for me, and the Megalodon is just a sweet spot. And I would say the Basilo's not really an overlooked creature, which is why I haven't included it on this list, is it's a really great creature, and obviously it doesn't get hurt by the electric eels and the jellyfish, which does play a huge benefit. But I feel like people don't give the Megalodon enough credit for what it actually deserves, because it really is a powerful creature, which does have an alpha variant, so it means Wildcard did definitely care about it when designing it. And when Ark actually came out, this was like one of the only ocean creatures actually in the game at the time. And also they deal the bleed ability as well, which again does play a huge factor when it comes to damage dealing of these creatures. They can just deal a lot more damage because of that bleed ability, which makes them pretty good combat creatures. And if you're thinking of doing the Moda on Genesis Part 1, as always, just tame yourself an X-Megalodon and you're going to have yourself a blast of a time. Obviously you're not going to have one, you're going to have multiple, but I find they kind of do better for that boss fight than Modas, because they don't get stuck in the whirlpools as much. Next up, we've got the Velonosaur, and this creature is essentially a portable turret. And I know there are a couple of you out there that just really don't like this creature or value it, and you know, you can be that person, but still, for me, I really like this creature. I find its abilities quite cool and inventive for me, and it's quite useful to hit creatures from long range. And you might think it's a bit gimmicky when you first use it, but then I'm at a stage now where I really like it. And with the Velonosaur on Gen 2, you can have an even more powerful version. Obviously you wouldn't use the kind of spikes this close, but I'm just kind of generally showing you a demonstration. And sadly, they don't scale when you level up melee damage, only the melee attacks, but those melee attacks are pretty hefty as well. And again, with the size of this thing, it makes it a pretty decent caving creature as well, which you maybe might not expect, especially on Extinction actually, because those caves are really big and you can just quickly get through them. Obviously you're not going to be doing any of the Titans with this creature, because it's nowhere near as powerful as something like a Giga or a Carnotaurus, so it probably doesn't really have too much of a chance against the Titans. But against pretty much everything else in Extinction on other maps, actually, you can even use it for some boss fights on some other maps, although maybe wouldn't recommend it the most. They really do pack a punch, and they're pretty decent for some PvP scenarios as well, although I'm mainly a PvE player. Next up, at number 3, we have got the Baryonyx, and this creature for my uses is the go-to caving creature, and I feel like people don't give this creature enough credit for what it actually can do, and just resort to creatures like the Shadowmane because it's the newer creature that's just like the better one supposedly. And I do admit the Shadowmane largely is better than the Baryonyx, but still that thing is significantly harder to tame than the Baryonyx and a lot less accessible as well. And I still kind of like to go back to my nostalgia-y roots, which you might think is maybe a little bit crude of me, but still, when I think of this creature, I think of caving. When I think of the Shadowmane, I don't think of caving, and I have done some caving with the Shadowmane. It's just, for me, it's not as enjoyable. I know that's not really a valid excuse. You just want a really good caving creature, but the Baryonyx really can do that. And again, it's really great at underwater caves as well. You might think, well, the Shadowmane is just better at underwater caves then, because, you know, it's a really fast swimmer and good in the water. Well, this thing kind of has a slight edge. It doesn't have the hydration buff. Kind of think it should, to be honest, considering the Spino has it, and it's kind of Spino-like. I know it doesn't have the spine bit, but, you know, it makes sense. But yeah, it can stun creatures up to the size of a Megalodon, like you've seen there, so it's a really nice, useful ability for it to have. Now, I'm really one for the Carno, and that's why I put this creature in at the number 2 spot, because this creature is just so overlooked in my opinion. People always go for the Allo, and yes, now on ASA the Allo and the Carno pretty much as easy to tame as each other because of the new baby like taming methods thing, but still the Carno in my opinion is just the more preferable creature to me because it's smaller, still deals a lot of bleed damage. Obviously the bleed damage is the same regardless of what creature, but it deals the bleed damage like the Allosaurus, and although maybe it doesn't have the pack buff and all of that, and it isn't quite as powerful a creature, I still think its smaller size, it really just nets it as the better creature for me, and also the level that it's unlocked. I know they're still quite similar, but I still think this is kind of my goal for first carnivore in Ark, and I feel like people overlook this creature for something maybe better that you might want to use instead, and you can obviously go for those creatures as well. But again, I know it kind of comes back to nostalgia a little bit, but I do feel quite nostalgic for this creature. They're some of the first carnivores that I ever tamed, and I still really like using them. And obviously they did have their TLCs and all of that stuff, so they're a lot better now than they used to be, but still I think people just really overlook them and don't use them as much as I think they should be used, as they are really good creatures to use. They're really easy to control, and they deal that bleed damage again, so they really do pack a punch in 2024. So I don't really get why too many people aren't using them, unless everyone's just for some reason going for the Allos every single time, which, you know, you could say is quite valid, and it mainly just depends on personal preference for that. At least in my opinion, it kind of depends what you want more of a carnivore. Do you want like a smaller carnivore, a larger carnivore, what kind of ability you want, and all of that. Damage and health, you probably just want the highest, but yeah, the Carno's in at number 2. And in at number 1, we have got the Bloodstalker, and maybe necessarily I don't think this creature's overlooked, but the reason why I've actually put it in at number 1 spot is what I use it for. I think people overlook it for, which is why I've put it in at this spot. And in my opinion, the Bloodstalker is the best underwater creature out there, with no exceptions to the rule. It is just miles ahead of any other creature which, you know, maybe might have some slight competition against it, like maybe the Basilo or the Facilosuchus when that thing actually comes out. I'll make my opinion on that actually when it releases, when Scorched Earth comes out, of course. And also like creatures like the Shadowmane and all of that, you might say they compete with it, but the Bloodstalker is just, it's so versatile in all it can do. It can glide across the top of the water, again the Maven can as well, but in the water it's really fast and agile. You can also seal the creatures, so it's kind of like having an awesome Spyglass mod, but you don't actually need the mod, and you can see the aggroed of creatures. You can actually see if creatures are aggroed onto you, if you need to get away from them instead of just staring at them and seeing what they do next. You can see if they're aggro to you. They actually, usually when creatures aggro, they'll either attack you or just run away for some reason. Don't know why that really happens, but you know, I get it happens when you get them to high torpor, but even if they don't have high torpor, sometimes the creatures will do that. RKI is a little bit weird, to be fair. But yeah, the Bloodstalker, in my opinion, is the best underwater travel mount, and I think it is really overlooked for that. And it's just
seen as a good like traveling mount, and it's good for getting hexagons on Gen 1 because you know there's those missions that use it and it's a useful creature to learn. But I don't think enough people use it for those underwater abilities, which I really personally love this creature for. But anyway, that is the end of today's video, and I really hope that you all enjoyed this one, as I very much did enjoy making it. As always, comment down below what is the most overlooked Arc Tame, and if you didn't agree, comment your top 10 down below, and I'll see you all later.